Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. We have a lot to talk about. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse retaking the #1 spot at the weekend box office. The Flash nearly falling to number 4, but also taking a big tumble as far as its week-to-week hold, as well as a lot of other updates. So let's get right to it. Before we do though, I want to remind you of a couple things. Number one, I am available now on Cameo. It's something fun I've been doing for the last several weeks, and I've been able to interact with so many people and do a lot of fun stuff. So if that seems like something that you would want for yourself, that you would perhaps want to gift to somebody, that's been something really fun to do. You can find more about that down in the description below. Also, I'm introducing a new feature at the end of this episode when I talk about the movies that are opening this week. I'm also going to be looking at the scores on Rotten Tomatoes and how those movies stack out with the tomato meter versus the average rating. And there's some very interesting results there, so be sure to hang around till the end of the show just in case you check out a little early on the regular. So with all that said, let's look at the weekend box office for this past weekend, and we will start with the box office top 10. At number 1, as I mentioned, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse in its fourth week, reclaiming the #1 spot after a 29.6% drop from the weekend before. Across the Spider-Verse is the beneficiary of positive audience response, positive reviews, and the fact that a lot of the movies that have come out in the last month or so just haven't really clicked with audiences. So that is a recipe for reclaiming that top spot. Its total box office right now is over the $300 million mark. In second place, with a hold that helps to mitigate its disappointing opening last week, is Pixar's Elemental. It dropped just 37.7% and actually did compete for that #1 spot. $18.4 million in its second weekend and a $65.4 million total. Not helping its box office narrative was The Flash, which dropped 72.5% in its second weekend for a $15.1 million total. We will definitely be looking more at that in just a few minutes. Its total box office so far is $87.5 million. Coming just $100,000 away from taking the number 3 spot was the new Jennifer Lawrence comedy No Hard Feelings, which exceeded box office expectations. A total just over $15 million, and we'll see how it plays in the weeks to come. At number 5 is Transformers Rise of the Beasts, finally with a decent hold, 43.2% drop off in week 4 for an $11.7 million weekend total and a total box office of just over $123 million. I am regretting leaving it off my summer top 10 more with every passing week. At number 6, expanding into wide release, is Wes Anderson's Asteroid City, a 960% increase from last weekend, but that's because it was only in 6 theaters last weekend. So a total of $9 million for the weekend and a running box office total of just over $10.2 million. The best hold in the top 10 this weekend went to The Little Mermaid. In its 5th week, it dropped just 22.6% from last weekend for an $8.5 million total and a $270.1 million overall domestic total. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 also continuing to hold well in its 8th week, a 34.4% drop and a $3.4 million total as it enters the end of its box office run. Its domestic total is now over $350 million. In its 2nd week, The Blackening drops less than 50%, 49.4% to be exact, and a box office total of just over $3 million. Its domestic total is now over $12 million. And in its 4th weekend release, The Boogeyman drops 29.9% for a $2.5 million total and an overall box office total of $37.7 million. Dropping out of the top 10 after 5 weeks is Fast X, a disappointing run for that film domestically. And after just 1 week, the Indian film Adipurush is out of the top 10. And I mentioned a disappointing domestic run for Fast X. It has now just barely passed the domestic total, not adjusted for inflation, of 2001's The Fast and the Furious. Now the question is, does it have another $11 million or so left to pass Fast and Furious? But it's either going to be the 7th or 8th highest grossing film of the franchise domestically. It's going to fall well short of the last film in the Fast saga, which was F9, as well as the spin-off film Hobbs and Shaw, and then of course even more short of the franchise's glory days. We will break down more with Fast X in the weeks to come because of course there's also the worldwide total, but it is not meeting box office expectations, largely because of that massive budget attached to the film. Looking at what I like to call the road to recovery, these lines you see here are the average box office totals for pre and post pandemic, or basically pandemic theater closures. So the red line is the weekend average for 2021 and 2022. The blue line is the weekend average for 2015 through 2019, so the 5 years preceding the pandemic. And then that dotted black line is this year. And after a pretty impressive run earlier this summer, we almost were basically at the same box office total for this past weekend that we've been averaging out since theaters reopened in the last couple years. The highest grossing film for the 2021 to 2022 window was last year's debut of Elvis. That was actually a pretty good weekend. Elvis debuted, The Black Phone debuted, Top Gun Maverick continued its run, Jurassic World Dominion continued its run, and the disappointing returns on The Flash and Elemental basically took us almost down to where we have been the last couple years. So that's not great news. When we look back at the pre-pandemic average, the highest performing film from that 2015 to 2019 window was the opening of Jurassic World Dominion. But traditionally, as we get into late June and going into July 4th, that is when the summer box office has been hitting its stride. That's when we see the biggest hits released. And that has not been the case this summer. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is not tracking to reverse that trend, and it is yet another movie with a massive budget attached. So I will be keeping an eye on that, hoping just for the sake of the business that it exceeds what it's projected to open to this upcoming weekend. But it's also part of the July 4th holiday weekend, which falls in the middle of the week this year. So the opening weekend coming up, we'll see how it does. Does it pick up strength as it goes into the holiday? Not quite sure. I actually don't even really know when I'm going to be doing this show next week, because if I were to do it next Tuesday, as usual, that would fall on July 4th. I don't know how studios are going to be reporting grosses, so it's even possible that this show gets pushed later into the week next week. We'll just have to see how it goes. Let's look outside the domestic marketplace to the top 5 films internationally, and at number 1 is a film from China called Lost in the Stars. This past weekend was the tail end of the Chinese Dragon Boat Festival, which means, as happens on all Chinese holidays now pretty much, the focus is on films made in China. Lost in the Stars is a mystery film from one of the writers of the popular Detective Chinatown series, so that becomes the highest grossing film internationally. In second place is Elemental, and that's because it opened in a lot of countries this past weekend. I mentioned on last week's show that we didn't quite know what the worldwide picture for the film was going to look like, because it's still rolling out around the globe and it continues to roll out, but that's why it's in second place, along with the disappointing returns for The Flash. The Flash is in third place internationally with $26.6 million, but only $1 million ahead of Transformers Rise of the Beast, which is in fourth place, and then Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, which is in fifth place. When you take those international totals, you combine them with our domestic box office totals, you get the worldwide box office for the past weekend, and Lost in the Stars is still number 1. Elemental is still number 2 with $49.7 million, and The Flash is barely number 3 with $41.7 million. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is number 4 at just over $41 million, and then Transformers Rise of the Beast rounds out the top 5 with $37.3 million. So we have so many movies that are moving around in the top 10 that are hitting milestones, so I want to take them kind of, not all of them, but most of them individually, and let's start with the number 1 film, which is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. It's doing very well domestically. It's doing pretty well globally, especially when you compare it to its production budget. Now, there was some coverage that came out this past week saying that the production budget was potentially higher than the $100 million that's been reported, and I am looking into that. If I need to change my figures as far as the profit stuff for the movie, then I will do that. But looking at the franchise tracker as far as worldwide box office total, it has now breached the $500 million barrier. It has outgrossed 2021's Venom Let There Be Carnage. Now, there is a long way to go if it wants to surpass The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but the legs on this film have been long, so we will continue to track it. It's also looking at some more domestic milestones. Remember, these franchise trackers, I'm only going to update week to week if there are updates for the various films. There are a lot of updates for The Flash. The Flash was one of those things last week we talked about. There really was no silver lining to the opening weekend of The Flash. Well, there is also no silver lining to the second week of The Flash. Any hope that there could have been positive word of mouth, and looking at the cinema score, there really wasn't much hope. really went out the window, and it had one of the worst drops ever seen for a Marvel or DC comic book film. Let's look first at the worst second weekend drop-offs for films based on DC Comics. Well, the only good news for The Flash is that it isn't Steel, because Shaquille O'Neal's Superman spinoff film still holds the record, and that's going to be a pretty hard record to break. It dropped 78% between weekend 1 and weekend 2, but in second place is The Flash with its 72.5% drop. I guess the only good thing is it wasn't 75%, like some people thought it might be. I don't know. We're really reaching here. In third place was The Suicide Squad, which of course was also released day and date on HBO Max at 71.49%. I'm precise there because that was basically a tiebreaker for the next chart that we're going to use. Then Jonah Hex at 69.7%. And then of course the famous Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice second weekend drop at 69.1%. Looking at second weekend drop-offs by both Marvel and DC, Steel is still at the top of this chart with its 78% drop-off. In second place is Spider-Man No Way Home, the more fun stuff version, which was the re-release they put out last year with all of the added scenes. It dropped off 75.3% from weekend 1 to weekend 2, and some people might say, well, that doesn't count. But the weekend that it was released, I think it was the widest release in the country, and it didn't really lose too many screens from weekend 1 to weekend 2, so I'm not going to disqualify it. It gets second place here. In third place, infamously, again, is Morbius, 73.8% drop from weekend 1 to weekend 2, barely avoiding the Fate Worse Than Death, which would be doing worse than Morbius in its second weekend by percentage, is The Flash with 72.5%. And then just eking out that number 5 spot is X-Men Dark Phoenix. It dropped 71.5%. The Suicide Squad dropped 71.49%, which means that Dark Phoenix gets that not coveted spot at number 5 on this chart. Looking at the franchise tracker for the DCEU domestically, well, The Flash has passed Wonder Woman 1984, The Suicide Squad, Shazam! Fury of the Gods, and Birds of Prey. But look at how much it has to go just to pass Shazam. Right now it's at $87.5 million. Shazam made $140.3 million. I think it is highly unlikely that The Flash bypasses the domestic total of Shazam, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. I mean, with all the hype on this movie, you would think that it could potentially have passed the first Shazam in its opening weekend, and maybe in years past it would have, but certainly not in the marketplace today. I don't think it's going to measure up really to any of these other DC films, and that is just a massive failure for Warner Brothers Discovery and for the DC universe in general, even though it's coming to an end in its current iteration. Looking at the franchise tracker by domestic gross adjusted for inflation, it's still behind Birds of Prey. Again, it's going to pass that film, but it's going to be stuck at number 9 there. And then looking at the DCEU by worldwide gross, it has passed the same 4 films, which are the pandemic-related films, and also Shazam! Fury of the Gods and Birds of Prey. And again, I don't think it's going to match Shazam worldwide. $363.5 million. That would mean that The Flash would have to make another $150 million worldwide. At the rate that this is dropping, it may not see $300 million worldwide. It is reportedly already coming out on streaming platforms in less than a month. It's an unmitigated financial disaster, and to kind of look at this run to profitability chart here, again, this is theatrical grosses only, and given the market estimates that I have in hand, with a budget of $225 million and an estimated print and advertising budget of $100 million, given the net gross so far based on the percentage coming back from its run in various markets, I have it netting basically $96.7 million out of a $210.8 million worldwide gross thus far, which means that it is $228.2 million short of turning a profit in the theatrical window, which means that all of those other revenue streams, home video, digital rentals, etc., those are all going to be poured into trying to make this movie break even, and I think it's highly unlikely that that happens. This is going to be a massive financial money loser for Warner Brothers Discovery. It did not catch on anywhere in weekend 2, domestically or worldwide. It's a bomb. It is a box office bomb. It is one of those things, a lot of times on this show I say like, well, yeah, we should qualify it with this, or you have to take this into consideration. No, The Flash is a massive flop, and nothing at this point is going to change that. I spoke a little bit about Elemental and its second weekend hold. When we look at the franchise tracker for Pixar domestically, it has now passed Onward, so it's now not the lowest grossing Pixar film of all time, so yay for Elemental. But it still has ways to go if it wants to move up this chart anymore, which would be to bypass Lightyear's gross from last summer at $118.3 million. When you look at the franchise chart by adjusted gross, it is still a little bit short of Onward, but it will still pass that film, probably this week. And really the question is, does it have the legs to get to Lightyear? I don't know if it's got the legs to get to $150 million. And I think that that's kind of the big thing here is, yes, it held well, and that certainly helps Pixar and Disney save face rather than being something like a Warner Brothers where you see a movie that has a bad opening and then a disastrous second weekend. But it also has a huge hill to climb, not just domestically, but also worldwide. When we look at the Pixar worldwide chart, it's at $121 million, which means it has now bypassed all of the pandemic films that didn't even get domestic theatrical releases, and it's moving toward beating Onward at the worldwide box office. Of course, its theatrical run was cut short by COVID closing theaters, but then you've got to say, well, does it get to Lightyear? Okay, yeah, it maybe could if it keeps holding the way that it's doing. Does it get to The Good Dinosaur at $333.7 million? Well, I think that's a big question, and I think it's likely that the answer is no. And it's good that Elemental held well in its second weekend, but that doesn't really change a whole lot about its financial situation other than kind of mitigating the damage. When we look at its profitability picture here, again, a huge budget, $200 million, prints and advertising budget of $100 million. That could be higher. We'll have to see if those numbers come in. It has a worldwide gross right now of $121 million. I have it netting about $84.7 million of that gross. Why so high? Because most of that money has come so far from its domestic release. That's why the net is so high on the movie. But with costs at $300 million, I still have Elemental with a shortfall of $215.2 million to break even in the theatrical window. So yes, if it continues to do well worldwide, it is going to help stop the bleeding here. But I think the path to profitability for Elemental is a very difficult one, if not impossible. Transformers Rise of the Beast is still kind of chugging along there in the top 5. I just wanted to point out here that it is on the precipice of passing a couple of box office milestones. It will soon bypass the domestic box office total of both Bumblebee and Transformers The Last Night, unadjusted for inflation, but it will not be advancing any higher than that on the chart. Still, a bit of a moral victory for the film to not come in as low as the last two films in the franchise have. Of course, if you adjust for inflation, that's a bit of a different story. Let's talk a little bit about Wes Anderson and Asteroid City. It rolled out of limited release a lot more quickly than many of Wes Anderson's other films, which makes the comparison as far as weekends a little bit tough. So I decided to look at his top performing weekends regardless of how long the movie's been out or what kind of release it was in. Just when you look at every single box office weekend for every single Wes Anderson film, what 5 weekends are his best performances? And when it comes to the record books, Asteroid City actually had the best single weekend performance for any Wes Anderson film at just over $9 million as it expanded into wide release. It beat the week 4 performance of the Grand Budapest Hotel, which was also rolling out into wide release at $8.5 million. And then you had the Royal Tenenbaums in its 4th week, also rolling out into wider release at $8.5 million. Then the 3rd week of Fantastic Mr. Fox, as it rolled into wide release at $6.9 million. And then the 3rd week of the Grand Budapest Hotel, which was expanding and did well at $6.7 million. Now, if you were to adjust for inflation, Asteroid City would not be the best performance in Wes Anderson's history because especially the Royal Tenenbaums would be right up there above it. But when you look at the record books, Asteroid City will have put up the best single weekend performance in Wes Anderson's entire history as a director. So that's a little bit of history being made. Let's look a little bit at Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. I mentioned that it's nearing the end of its theatrical release, but it is still moving up this chart when we look at the franchise tracker for the MCU. I've been saying for a while now that I thought that the movie would pass Thor: Love and Thunder and settle in right above its gross, and that's what we've seen so far because it's now the 14th highest grossing film in the history of the MCU. It has bypassed the box office total of last summer's Thor: Love and Thunder at just over $351 million. It is now just below Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 on the MCU franchise tracker. When we look at the franchise tracker by inflation-adjusted domestic gross, again, it has bypassed Thor: Love and Thunder. It's just under Thor: Ragnarok, which made $384.5 million adjusted for inflation. So will Guardians of the Galaxy make that much money? We'll see. It just depends on how it keeps holding. Are a lot of people going to go see it over the July 4th holiday weekend? And then, of course, once the gross for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 has been finalized, I will do a final overlook at its box office position, and it is also still as of right now, the number one movie of the summer. And let's look at the summer box office chart. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 for now is at number one with $351 million. The big question is, this time next week, or perhaps after the July 4th holiday, will it still hold that position? Because Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is holding strong. It's right now at number two with $316.7 million. The Little Mermaid is in third place with $270.1 million. Then we have Fast X in fourth place, Transformers Rise of the Beasts in fifth place, and then The Flash in sixth place at $87.5 million. Elementals in seventh place, The Boogeyman's in eighth place, Book Club The Next Chapter's in ninth, and then No Hard Feelings is able to muster up an opening strong enough to enter the top 10 chart at number 10, bumping About My Father off of the summer top 10. Looking at my predictions versus the actual summer so far, as I said before, I will own my incorrect guess that The Little Mermaid would be the number one movie of the summer so far, but Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse right now at number two looks like a good bet, at least for me putting it up high on the list. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, I predicted third place. It's currently in first place. I had The Flash as the fourth highest grossing film of the summer. I believed the hype. That might be my biggest dumb move. We'll see if it even makes the top 10. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, I picked at number 5. It has yet to open. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny opens this weekend. I picked it at number 6. I picked Elemental at number 7, which is where it currently sits on the summer chart. We'll see how long it hangs around. I had Fast X in 8th place. I feel okay about that choice. And then at number 9 and number 10, it's going to be a big weekend for me here in a few weeks. I have Oppenheimer and Barbie both on my summer top 10 list. So we'll see how things continue to develop as we get into the month of July. Looking at the race for number 1 and what the number 1 summer movie will be, the purple line there you see is Across the Spider-Verse, the blue line is Guardians Volume 3, and the orange line is The Little Mermaid. I'm putting The Little Mermaid and continuing to track it here so I can just sit and stew in my failure, because you can see just how short it is going to fall of being the number 1 movie of the summer. And Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse at this point in its release continues to track ahead of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Now, the big concern was that the weekends were tightening up a little bit, that Guardians 3 was kind of closing the gap, but that Spider-Man, because it's out during the summer, was able to kind of widen it during the weekdays. But you see, because it did so well this weekend, it kept that lead over the weekend from where Guardians 3 was running at this point. So I think that it is likely, or certainly much more likely, that it will overtake Guardians 3 to be the number 1 movie of the summer, unless, as I mentioned, another movie like Mission Impossible comes in and is able to usurp all 3 of these films. So this is something that we're going to keep tracking throughout the summer. We have so much more to get to on the show, but before we do, I want to take a moment to thank this week's sponsors. This episode is brought to you by Factor. You know, July 4th barbecues are coming up, so that's one meal that's easy to plan. But what about all the others, especially during the time of year where you want to spend more time outside and less time prepping food? Well, that's where Factor comes in. America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit can help you fuel up fast with ready-to-eat meals delivered straight to your door. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are ready in just 2 minutes, so all you have to do is heat and enjoy, then get back outside to soak up that summer sun. Whether you're looking for calorie-conscious options or an extra boost of energy, Factor offers delicious flavor-packed options on the menu each week to fit a variety of lifestyles, from keto to calorie smart, vegan plus veggie, and protein plus. With 34 plus chef-prepared, dietitian-approved weekly options, there's always something new to try. Plus, you can round out your meal assortment and replenish your snack supply with an assortment of 45 plus add-ons, including breakfast items and shakes. And it's great for a budget, because not only is Factor cheaper than takeout, but meals are ready faster than restaurant delivery in just 2 minutes. Head to factormeals.com/Murrell50 and use code Murrell50 to get 50% off your first box. That's code Murrell, Murrell 50 at factormeals.com/Murrell50 to get 50% off your first box. This show's brought to you by AG1, a daily foundational nutrition supplement that supports whole body health. It is prime summer travel season and a great time to gather with friends, which means it's also the perfect time to make sure that your body is firing on all cylinders. I drink AG1 every morning, and it helps me feel like I'm covering my nutritional bases. I've been traveling, the channel keeps me busy, I'm planning a wedding. It's important for me to keep things on track when it comes to my immune system, gut health, and so much more. I've struggled in the past with keeping to a routine, but drinking AG1 is as simple as making my breakfast drink in the morning. It's just 1 scoop of powder mixed with water once a day. That's it. and each scoop is packed with 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients. And I also have some single serving AG1 travel packs, so I never have to miss a day, even when I'm on the go. With AG1, it's really just that simple. If you want to take ownership of your health, try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Just go to drinkag1.com/Dan. That's drinkag1.com/Dan. Check it out. Let's look at the top per theater averages for this past weekend, and I think that this is kind of a rare feat. Last week, Asteroid City was the top per theater earner in limited release. This week, Asteroid City is the top per theater earner in wide release. It was in 1,675 theaters and brought in $5,405 per theater, which means that there are still a bunch of happy theater owners that they booked Asteroid City this past weekend. In second place in just one theater is a 4K restoration of the film The Mother and the Whore. I hear you laughing back there. It's art. Be serious. $5,135 in that one theater. In third place is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, $5,021 per theater in 3,785 theaters. No Hard Feelings comes in fourth place with $4,677 per theater. And in fifth place is Elemental with $4,571 per theater. Looking at the films in limited release, this would be 1,000 theaters or fewer. With Asteroid City out of the way, Past Lives reclaims the top spot in 296 theaters and a $1.1 million total. I would very much like to bring you my thoughts on Past Lives, but even though it expanded into many more theaters this past weekend, it did not expand into any theaters in my state, and I've reached out to the PR people behind the film, and they said that it's going to open in one theater, kind of in the college town in my state, a few hours away, but it's still not scheduled to open here in my market, which is the largest market in the state, and I think it's because, there's still this idea of like, well, the college kids love the indie movies, but, these other people, they don't care about it. And I'm telling you, I went to see Asteroid City last Thursday night at the first available screening. It was almost a packed house. We have the screens, we have the passion here in this market, and that's why I like in many ways to be here to advocate for these places to send movies here, because we didn't get everything everywhere all at once for a while. We didn't get the Fablemans for a while. It's now a while till we get Past Lives. There is a hunger for these movies everywhere, and I passed this along to the PR person. They said they would pass it along to A24, but still I think that everyone in the country deserves at least a chance to see these great movies in some reasonable amount of time without having to travel hours and hours and hours away. I doubt we'll ever get there, but hey, I'm going to keep banging the drum for it. In second place in its second week was the Indian film Adipurush with $154,000 in 147 theaters. You Hurt My Feelings, still on the charts in 151 theaters with just over $97,000. In fourth place, the new documentary The Last Rider brings in $57,000 in 105 theaters. And then The Roundup, No Way Out, returning to the chart, playing in 14 theaters and bringing in just over $56,000. Looking at the top grossers in limited release this year, and this is all tickets sold since January 1st, so it doesn't matter when the movie initially came out, Pathan remains number 1 with Return of the Jedi at number 2 and A Man Called Otto at number 3. Nefarious is at number 4. Ponniyin Selvan moves up to number 5 with $5.3 million, which moves Women Talking down to number 6. And then number 7, 8, and 9 remain the same. The Wandering Earth 2, You Hurt My Feelings, Mummies, and Beau is Afraid. Of course, many of these movies would go on to expand into wide release, so this chart reflects how much money they made in limited release prior to that expansion. Of course, many of these theaters are shown at the independent theaters that are scattered around the country, and I love to feature them here on this show as we've been doing for the last several weeks. Not only do they get the spotlight here, but 10% of the ad revenue from the episode that these theaters are featured on will go then to that theater. And the theater that we're talking about today is the Plaza Theater in Atlanta, Georgia, which was opened in 1939. It played some of Hollywood's most classic films before becoming an adult theater in the 1970s. Then in the 1980s, it was bought and renovated to become a 2-screen theater. Back in 2006, the theater was bought and became a nonprofit organization, and it now holds the title of the oldest continually operating movie theater in Atlanta, and also lays claim to being the only independent theater in the city as well. The current manager, Christopher Escobar, took over several years ago. The theater survived the pandemic, and the Plaza now shows films in both 35 and 70 millimeter, and there are plans to continue to improve the theater facility facilities and expand programming. This week at the Plaza, you can catch first-run movies like Asteroid City and The Blackening, as well as Friday shows of 2001: A Space Odyssey in 70mm, and a live Rocky Horror Picture Show event. You can find out more at plazaatlanta.com to see what their schedule is and to pick up tickets. And of course, if you do end up showing up, be sure to tell them that Dan sent you. All right, let's look at some annual charts for 2023, and we'll look first at the domestic box office for the year. The Super Mario Bros. Movie remains number one, and I don't see anybody threatening it anytime soon. $572.9 million. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is in second place, followed by Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse and The Little Mermaid in fourth place. In fifth place is Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania at $214.5 million, and the box office reporting services now have that gross as closed, meaning that the theatrical run for Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is wrapped up domestically and is pretty much wrapped up worldwide. So let's take a look now at the final financial picture for Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, and again using this basic tracker as far as what was its profit in the theatrical window, and looking at its gross, it brought in about $8.8 million from China, about $88.8 million from its worldwide release, about $81 million from its first week, $21.5 million from week 2, and $20 million from week 3. That's why legs are so important on movies like this. A reported budget of $200 million and an advertising cost of $100 million. That means it brought in a total worldwide gross of $476 million. From that, it netted $220 million. When you put that up against the cost of the movie, I estimate that in the theatrical window, that Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania lost $79.5 million. Now, I'm not saying that the movie necessarily lost the studio money. I just mean that it lost $79.5 million theatrically, which means all of the partnerships that you have when you bring in brands to partner with you, that money now goes into trying to fill in the loss in the theatrical window. So it cuts down on your profit. I don't necessarily know if it's going to be a full money loser like The Flash, for example, but it's certainly not going to be a big money maker for Marvel and for Disney. And I can't imagine that's what they want, considering that they were launching the Kang storyline and there's all kinds of other stuff going on there and everything else that's supposed to be this big consequential stuff, and audiences really just didn't care about the movie, and by my estimation, I have it here, losing money in the theatrical window. One movie that I don't have losing money in the theatrical window is John Wick Chapter 4. It also reportedly has closed its theatrical run with a final gross of $187.1 million, and when we look at the profit breakdown for that movie against a budget of $100 million and an advertising budget of $80 million, and that's kind of from researching what they spent on previous films. I have John Wick Chapter 4 when you take in a net gross of $203 million from a worldwide gross of $432 million, making a theatrical profit of $23 million. And again, some people might look at that and say like, $23 million, that's it? Well, $23 million and then everything else the movie makes, when you rent it on digital, if you buy it on Blu-ray, all of the money that it made with the tie-ins and other stuff, that's on top of the money it made in the theatrical window. And I think that that's what many people maybe don't get or don't know about the box office is, yes, it's great to have a Mario style hit or an Avatar style hit where the theatrical ticket sales alone generate hundreds of millions of dollars for the studio. That's great. It's wonderful when that happens. But for a lot of studios with these movies, they are multi-armed marketing machines. And so if you have a movie like John Wick Chapter 4 that's able to bring in $25, $50, $75 million profit theatrically, well, that means that you're bringing in even more because all of the other stuff isn't, again, filling in that hole that you've dug for yourself at the box office. So that's really what you want if you're a studio. You want to not lose money at the box office, because if you don't lose money, then all of the other stuff begins to pile up. But if you do lose money, well, then it's basically just throwing money down into this money pit, which is not what you want. John Wick Chapter 4 ends its theatrical run as the highest-grossing John Wick movie domestically. It also ends its theatrical run as the highest-grossing John Wick film worldwide by over $100 million. So this movie has taken a step upward when it comes to theatrical gross every single time. The only thing it did not do was top the chart when it comes to domestic gross adjusted for inflation. It falls about $14 million short of John Wick Chapter 3 Parabellum, but still, by just about every metric, John Wick Chapter 4 is a successful film. In 7th place is Creed 3 with $156.2 million. In 8th place, Fast X with $144.5 million. Transformers Rise of the Beasts moves up to 9th place, bypassing Scream 6, which now bumps down to 10th place. Looking at the 2023 worldwide box office, we have the Super Mario Bros. Movie at $1.33 billion, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 at $824 million, then Fast X, which is now just shy of $700 million, Full River Red and The Wandering Earth are at numbers 4 and 5, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse looking to move up the chart, it's right now at $559.9 million in 6th place. The Little Mermaid is just shy of $500 million worldwide at $499.2 million. Then we have Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania at $463.6 million, John Wick Chapter 4 at $432.3 million, and still reporting some grosses from around the world. That's why it's not marked final here. And Transformers Rise of the Beasts at $341.4 million. Before we go, as always, I want to take a look at a weekend in box office history, and this may not be the complete picture because this is an older weekend where box office data isn't as complete, but I just wanted to look at this stacked lineup. We are going back to the weekend of June 19th through the 21st, 1981, the 25th weekend of the year, which saw the debut of Superman 2. It debuted to $14.1 million, which was, at that time, the highest grossing opening weekend of all time. It beat the record that was set in 1979 by Star Trek: The Motion Picture. In second place, opening the same week, was The Cannonball Run with $11.7 million. Then in third place was a movie in its second week of release called Raiders of the Lost Ark, which dropped just 3% from the previous week and made over $8 million. It would go on to an incredible box office run and spawn 4 sequels, including Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, which opens this weekend. In fourth place, in its second week of release, was Mel Brooks' History of the World Part 1. It made $3.1 million for the weekend, although I do not have a total box office gross. And then in fifth place, according to available information, was Cheech and Chong's Nice Dreams, also in its second week, with $3.1 million. Of course, here on the show, we don't just leave those grosses sitting there. We like to see what they would look like in today's dollars, which means that we are going to hit the inflation button. And when we do, we see that Superman 2 opened to the equivalent of $47.1 million in its opening weekend, ahead of The Cannonball Run with $39.3 million and Raiders of the Lost Ark with a second weekend of $26.8 million. Again, the key thing on all of those movies is that longevity is how you would rack up box office grosses. History of the World Part 1 comes in fourth place with $10.6 million, and Cheech and Chong's Nice Dreams is in fifth place with $10.4 million. Before we wrap up, let's take a look at what's opening in theaters this week. First of all, starting on tomorrow is the film Spy, which is a Telugu language film from India. Also opening this week on Thursday is Satyaprem Ki Katha, which is a Hindi language musical romance from India. So 2 big Indian releases coming up this week. On Friday, of course, as I mentioned a few times, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny hits theaters. Also on Friday, a new animated film from DreamWorks called Ruby Gillman Teenage Kraken, which does not look to be having a big opening weekend. It looks to be having a very low opening weekend, so I'm sure we'll be talking about that next week. Also on Friday in limited release is the film The Child, which is from South Korean director Park Hoon-jung. Prisoner's Daughter opens on Friday as well in limited release from director Catherine Hardwicke. It stars Brian Cox and Kate Beckinsale about a dying prisoner who's released into the custody of his daughter. And as you look at movies that are hitting theaters this weekend and some that have been out for a while, of course, many people turn to Rotten Tomatoes to see what the critics are saying. And I've often said that it can be a little tough to parse those results because of the binary fresh rotten metric and the way it can kind of skew critical reactions. So to round out the show, I'm going to start a new feature that I'm calling Rotten Tomatoes Decoded, where we look at the films by the tomato meter and then we look at them by the average rating, which I think is much more reflective of critical consensus. So let's look first of all at the films that are in theaters. These are major releases from the last 6 weeks and also some movies that are expanding into theaters. So when we look at this by tomato meter, in the rotten category, we have Transformers Rise of the Beasts hanging out right around 54%. Then we have Indiana Jones and the Boogeyman with the same score right now at around 63%. The Flash is there at 65%. The Little Mermaid's there at 67%. And then No Hard Feelings is there at 68%. So everybody kind of clustered together. At 75% on the tomato meter, currently we have Asteroid City and Ruby Gillman Teenage Kraken, although there are very few reviews out as of the time I'm doing this video for Ruby Gillman. Then just ahead at 76% is Elemental. Then we have a pretty big jump to The Blackening at 86%. And then right next to each other at 96 and 97%, we have Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse and Past Lives. And this is good for general critics' consensus, but look at how this changes when we look at all of these movies by the average rating from critics. Here we see Transformers Rise of the Beasts falls back a little bit with a 5.2 average rating. And look at the difference for Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken. It has a tomato meter score of 75 plus at the time of this video, but its average rating was only a 5.6. What does this say about the film? Well, if the tomato meter score stays where it is, it means that if you just look at that number, it may indicate that critics are a little more positive on that movie than they actually are, because to jump all the way back to that rating from where it is a pretty big jump. But again, there aren't that many reviews out there, so there is going to be some variation early on. Right there at that fresh line, which would be the equivalent of a 6.0 rating, we have No Hard Feelings and The Boogeyman, which are at 6.0. Then we have The Little Mermaid, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, and The Flash, all at the same rating at about 6.3. Elemental's there at 6.5. Then we have The Blackening, which moves back a little bit, but has the same average rating of Asteroid City at 7.1. Then we have Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse at about 8.6, and then a much bigger gap before we get to Past Lives at 9.1. So what does this tell us? Well, first of all, when you look at this chart, it is the summer of, as I believe the kids would say, mid, because a lot of these movies aren't doing much better than a 6.5 rating. But if you're heading to theaters and you want to see what actual critical consensus says right now, the only movie that's above a 9 right now by average rating is Past Lives, and then you have Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse at 8.6. So those are your two best bets critically. Then if you want to go to two films that are pretty well received critically, you have The Blackening and Asteroid City, and then you just have that big cluster of all the movies behind that critics are really mixed on, with a little bit more of a negative reaction when it comes to Transformers Rise of the Beast. So I'm going to keep doing this from week to week because, first of all, I think it's interesting to see how this stuff changes, but I also think it's genuinely useful to have a resource that interprets the results from Rotten Tomatoes a little bit more than just looking at the reviews on the website and the tomato meter. So that's a new feature. Let me know if you like it down in the comments below, and thank you so much for spending part of your day here with me. As I mentioned, I'm not quite sure what day I'll be here next week. Maybe it'll be next Tuesday, July 4th. Maybe it will be after the holiday. It just kind of depends on what the studios do as far as reporting grosses. Regardless, the next time we talk, I'll be looking at the opening of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Is it going to exceed expectations, or are we going to be looking at yet another big budget Hollywood disappointment? Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out the description below for more information about our great sponsors this week, as well as information about booking me over on Cameo. And thank you so much for your time. I'll be back later this week with more movie news, reviews. I'm trying to put together a video of my favorite movies of the year so far, which is actually kind of tough given the quality of a lot of the films, but there's still a few great ones to talk about, and whatever I decide to do, because hey, you know, this is my channel. Thanks so much for hanging out and talking box office. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.